All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today's presentation is going to be managing today's cloud integration data platforms. One of the big things we're going to talk about is some of the myths that need to be busted about the cloud, and also scenarios that customers can use to be able to use it in specific situations. A couple ways of tying it into personal things that we use every single day, as well as an overview of the infrastructure and the way that you can explain it. So just a little about myself. I'm Bradley Ball. I've got around 15 years of IT experience. Cool previous things that I've done. I was the DBA for the U.S. Army, Executive Office of the President. Currently, I'm the Data Platform Management Lead for Pragmatic Works. I'm also a VPSP for Microsoft, which means that if you give them a call and say, hey, how can I use SQL Server in my environment, there's a chance that I could be the guy that gets on the phone to help you figure out how to use that. I've got my ITP in 2005 and 2008. I blog at SQLballs.com. I'm on Twitter at SQLballs. And my email is bball@pragmaticworks.com. So if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. So the agenda for today is we're going to discuss how you can explain the cloud. Because one of the key things to understand is how we can explain this to other people within our business in a way that makes sense not only to them, but makes sense to us as well. We're going to cover some common myths and misconceptions about the cloud, and then we're going to talk about different scenarios of where you can implement it. I also, in the references section, have several really good presentations that I found online. There was one recently on the networking additions and changes that was at TechEd earlier this month. My buddy Max Trinidad, who's a PowerShell MVP, has a really great presentation on PowerShell and Azure, and also some great scripts. And I've got a link to a 2-hour webinar that he recently did for a user group, and also a link to his blog at the end where he's got his deck and his demos available for download. So I'm going to make sure and point those out to you when we get to the end of the deck. And I will make sure that this slide deck is available on my blog at the end of the day. So first off, let's talk about the cloud. It's difficult to explain how and why we should use the cloud. One of the most common things that I encounter as I work with folks is trying to find a way that it makes sense to them of how they can integrate it with their business. On-prem makes a lot of sense to us, but the cloud sometimes can be very abstract. The way I want you to think about it, the best analogy that I've ever been able to come up with for people is to think about the cloud like driving in New York City. It's expensive to park in New York City. It's expensive to own a car in New York City. And this is going to equate to our on-prem servers. Makes sense. We have to have physical structure, we have to have infrastructure, and we're going to invest money, and it's going to depreciate over time. We also have mass transit. We have the subway, we have buses, and we have taxis. And there are varying levels of them, just like we have in the cloud. We have infrastructure as a service, we have platform as a service, and we have many different offerings for infrastructure as a service for the different sizes of VMs we have based on what we need and how we need to get to our location. So when you think about mass transit, that is the cloud. So what I want you to realize is that when we look at the cloud is like driving in New York. It's expensive to drive in New York, but people still do it. And that's the big thing to understand. People are always going to have their own hardware on-prem. You're always going to have the certain systems that are very dependent on high transaction throughput that need that big piece of hardware. And you're going to have people in your corporation that go, I'm willing to invest the money to have this on premise so we can set it up, we can control it. Not everyone, though, can afford to be able to have a car in New York. Most use mass transit, and that's the cloud. If you're starting out a new business nowadays, the startup time to purchase hardware, have a high-speed connection, have a data center, rent space in a data center, rent servers in a data center, can be very, very expensive. One of the key places that the cloud makes sense across the board is for small businesses or startups. But one thing you can also consider is whenever you need to be able to stand up something new. When you're looking at infrastructure costs, you can offset a lot of that by utilizing the cloud and its infrastructure. And some people with cars sometimes use mass transit. Just because somebody has a car in New York doesn't mean they're never going to use the subway, doesn't mean they're never going to use a cab, doesn't mean that they'll never use a bus. It's very, very common to use those things in New York, regardless of whether you own a car or not. So that's the other thing to keep in mind, is just because I want my on-prem server, just because I want to have those physical resources in front of me that I can take hold of and I can maintain and I can have control of, that doesn't mean that I can't use the cloud in some way, shape, or form. So remember, the cloud is like driving in New York. Parking is our on-prem. Mass transit is our cloud. And just because I have a car doesn't mean I'm never going to use mass transit. And the way that those scales, the way that we can use them, really depends on the scenario. And that's the big thing to understand. You don't ever want to force the cloud to be to fit into a place where it would not belong. However, there's a lot of places that you can utilize the cloud, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. First up, let's talk about a couple myths. Myth one about the cloud that I want us to tackle. I'm a DBA and the cloud will replace me. Before we really go that far, we need to understand that the things that the cloud offers, it offers infrastructure as a service, which is essentially SQL Server on Hyper-V. And it offers platform as a service, which is also known as SQL database. Infrastructure as a service is essentially Hyper-V. That's all it is. It's the ability to provision VMs on the Microsoft backplane. It's incredibly performant, incredibly powerful. You can also provision these VMs quite quickly. It's common to be able to provision one within a couple minutes. And remember, when you work with Hyper-V or you work with virtualization in your current workplace, it hasn't replaced anyone yet. As a matter of fact, the use of virtualization has done nothing but increase a DBA's job. It increases the knowledge that we have to know, increases the studying that we have to know. But if you're already working with VMs, one thing to realize is you can make the jump to infrastructure as a service, and you can immediately use the lessons that you've learned in previous places within your infrastructure. Platform as a service, SQL database, while it has some limitations on syntax and on physical structures, for example, you cannot have heaps in platform as a service. Everything has to have a clustered index on it. It is not a completely different physical structure.